in many ways, this movement that Keats represents, moving from Wordsworth and an idea of a guaranteed, some kind of guaranteed experience in nature, where that, let me put it this way, let me put it to you the way that we were talking about it in my first class today, having to do with subjectivity. For Wordsworth, the poet experiences nature as an other, right? And when the poet experiences nature as an other, the poet recognizes nature, and he is recognized back by nature, and therefore becomes a subject, becomes an I. So it's like it's like a baby being born. And Wordsworth does this over and over again in his poems. If you remember the poem, There Was a Boy, you remember the poet calls across to the owls, and they respond back to him, and then there's a kind of breakdown in that response, and in that moment, all of the kind of anxiety rushes in this silence, and this whole other experience comes to him. So usually, as I was saying earlier to my theory class, usually when this happens, instead of it being the poet and nature, it's usually the believer and God, right? When you experience God, when you pray to God, God returns that experience, and now you're in a loop, and now you are a subject. Now you are a child of God, etc. However you want to think about it, and this is true in almost every. Well, it's true in the monotheistic religions, which are the ones I know better, but like it may be true in others. It's not exactly true. It's certainly not true in Zen Buddhism, but it's true in some ways. You could think about it as being true sort of in other Buddhism. So this is the trajectory, and so for Romanticism, it becomes about becoming this I. And you notice that nature has taken over from God. That's very important for Romanticism, that it be a secular experience. It can also, in the love experience, it can be the lover. It doesn't have to be nature. It just happens to be nature in many of the Romantic poems. But it can also be a lover in that experience. You really witness them, and they witness you back, and you are granted your subjectivity. And again, the model for this, and it was the model for Romanticism too, if you read the first chapter of my book, it's the baby at the mother's breast becomes the kind of prototype for a kind of subjectivity coming into full being. So when the baby recognizes the mother as an other, it's both a terrifying moment and a wonderful moment. Because it's terrifying because the baby before that is undifferentiated. It doesn't have any existence apart from the mother, right? It doesn't experience anything except the pure being. Then when it's separated from the mother, it wants something and the mother isn't there, it experiences frustration. In that frustration, it's both a horrible moment because, oh my God, I'm alone, but oh my God, there's an I here that's separate from the you over there, and suddenly I have my own subjectivity. I am my whole fully fledged person. So that's the model. Now, Keats, so this is for Wordsworth, right? Keats, in his idea of negative capability, and in another letter that he writes, not to his brothers, but I'm blanking on who he writes it to. I suppose it doesn't matter, but he writes it to someone else, another poet, I think, and he says, the poet has no identity. This is Keats. And I forget who the letter is to, but I'll tell you next time. The poet has no identity. And what Keats says is like, unlike Wordsworth, when Keats, he says, when I go to a party, if I can kind of zone out and be in the corner, I pretty soon stop even being a presence and I just move out into the crowd and into the noise and everything like that. And I write my poetry from that perspective. Not from what he called Wordsworth. He referred to Wordsworth, whom he loved, by the way, but he referred to that kind of poetry as the egotistical sublime. And he rejects it. He rejects it because he thinks that this story, that where we get this I, the I becomes too large and it doesn't allow the poem to be its own thing. It becomes controlling of the poem. Right? And any of you who've played music, written poetry, written fiction, know what I'm talking about. When you start getting worried about, will people like this? Will my ego be satisfied by this? All real inspiration ceases to happen. It can only happen sort of when you get outside yourself for a moment. Or even if you play sports. I mean, it's probably even truer in sports. You watch, when sports psychologists work with sports players, it's all about learning mindfulness techniques so that they can get outside of themselves and just be kind of pure, not thinking, but just reacting to the ball, reacting to the basket, reacting to the player, so that you're not thinking about yourself and what you're doing and how you come across. That's what Keats is after. That's what negative capability is largely about. This ability to kind of just go like this. I just get rid of my eye for a period of time, right? So so any questions about that? I just wanted to kind of cover it again to give you this transition from here to there. Is that kind of clear? Okay, so we're going to experience another way of getting rid of this I, and it's much more tragic in a way. It's not so neat and aesthetically pleasing as this one. And that one comes from John Clare, who you have in your packet from last time. So we're wrapping up a few things from last time and trying to transition into this time. And the poet we're looking at here is the only true poet-peasant that we have, who is John Clare. So John Clare, who is borderline, by our standards, borderline illiterate. I mean, he could read a little bit and write a little bit, but he couldn't spell worth a darn. He didn't know punctuation at all. But he just simply was an organic poet. He simply was this kind of poet. So the poems I'd like to look at, so it'll be in the packet that has Mont Blanc in it. This one, which is the Romanticism 3 or something. I want to look at the last two poems. And we're going to, I think what I'm trying to get at here is that Romanticism, if we try to get around the egotistical sublime, it can be both a beautiful experience as it is in Keats, and it can be a terrifying experience, right? All right. So here's the poem, which is called Mouse's Nest. Do you see it in your packet? If you don't have the packet and somebody else has it, get next to somebody else. It is. Does anybody want to tell me the form of the poem? Here's the trick. Count the lines. How many lines? 14. Did I hear that? What poem has 14 lines? Sonnet. Good. It's a sonnet. But it's his own form of sonnet. He separates out the final quatrain, which is a little bit strange, but it's still a sonnet. Okay. You have to understand a couple things first. The area that he lived in was a very, very harsh part of England, not a beautiful part of England, not like the Lake District where Wordsworth lives, but in the south where it's very, very sparse. The days are kind of not very pretty. It's very muddy. A lot of like small little shrubbery plants everywhere. And what they would do is collect they couldn't collect wood because there weren't trees. It had been deforested, right? We know this about England. It had been deforested at a certain point. I mean, largely. There's now still forests there, but these forests had been deforested. And what you had in its place were these kind of like weedy bushes that they would take, and the bracken, just these little broken sticks, they would carry together and bring back to their house to burn for firewood. So it was about getting these little bits of grass. It was also about setting bird traps for people who were poor to catch birds to cook and eat. Okay, so there was not a ton. There was a lot of poverty in this area, and so this is kind of the background to this poem, Mouse's Nest. I understand that what he's doing is he is checking the bird traps that he had set, and probably picking up little pieces of wood to take home to burn in his fire. Right? I found a ball of grass among the hay and progged it as I passed and went away. And when I looked, I fancied something stirred, and turned again and hoped to catch the bird, when out an old mouse bolted in the wheats, with all her young ones hanging at her teats. She looked so odd and so grotesque to me. I ran and wondered what the thing could be, and pushed the knapweed bunches where I stood. Then the mouse hurried from the quaking brood. The young ones squeaked, and as I went away, she found her nest again among the hay. The water o'er the pebbles scarce could run, and broad old cesspools glittered in the sun. So it's very, very, you can see it's a very, very deflationary poem. It's not a very, inspiring poem. It's about, it's very, very minute. It's almost like, I get the feeling that I had, like in that horrible did anybody take the class where you had to dissect frogs and things like this, right? It's like that kind of feeling, right? It's just very, very close to the animal being, right? So what I want to say about John Clare in these poems and other poems like this, there's quite a few longer poems like The Badger that I could talk to you about, where what I feel is happening is that Clare does not identify with other people. Clare, in a weird way, identifies with animals. So he's almost the first real kind of poet that we have that kind of gives us, and I think he feels identified with animals because animals are not safe, they're hunted, they are judged, right? Like this mouse is being ugly and kind of grotesque. And I think that from his class position, he identifies most with these animals. So for example, there is a poem where he says that the most beautiful thing about this place where this bird goes is that no human has ever been there before. So it's untouched by humans. So in this instance of the poet having no identity, it's not because the poet chooses not to have an identity. It's because the poet doesn't count. Because the poet is poor, the poet is, you see what I'm saying? That there's a so it's one thing to say, I choose to have no identity, as Keats does, as a middle class poet. It's quite a different thing to be, I don't know, one of those immigrants stranded at the border, right? Who can't, who were like trying to flee like their conditions in Honduras or Guatemala or wherever, or El Salvador or wherever. They're sort of in a different situation where they have no identity, but they didn't choose it. You see, it was sort of foisted on them. So, to give you the story, it's not like I'm not making this up like, Clare or whatever. Clare has one book of poems. They're published, and they're quite successful. And everybody says, wow, he's a real peasant poet. We like these poems. And they invite him to things, and they kind of, it's sort of wonderful to have this outsider artist there, you know, and he kind of experiences it. But then he goes and he writes a second book of poems, and it's not very well received. Third book of poems is almost not, doesn't sell at all. And then he also is suffering from a number of things, probably depression and whatever, and he is then institutionalized for the rest of his life. Spends the rest of his life in a mental institution. And the kind of mental institution that we're talking about is pretty harsh, right? I mean, it's pretty much just like no treatment, really, just trying to keep people away from other people, from harming themselves or other people. And so it's pretty harsh. So the identity that he didn't have before is even more obscured. Now he goes to write a number of really, really wonderful poems, even while he is in the institution. And the last one that we have on this packet is called "I Am," and it's one of those poems. This is probably his most famous poem. It's unlike the Mouse's Nest in a way, but it definitely I think it speaks to this problem of having no identity. So can I get 3 volunteers to read section 1? Who will read section 2? How about a woman? 2? How about section 3? Yes. Okay.
You just want me to go? Okay. I am yet what I am, none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. They rise and vanish in oblivion's host, like shadows in love's frenzied, stifled throes, and yet I am and live like vapors tossed.
Into the
Yeah, right.
nothingness of scorn and noise, into the living sea of waking dreams, where there is neither sense of life or joys, but the vast shipwreck of my life's esteems. Even the dearest that I love the best are strange, nay, rather, stranger than the rest.
I long for scenes where man has never trod, a place where woman never smiled or wept, there to abide with my Creator God, and sleep as I in childhood sweetly slept, untroubled and untroubled where I lie, the grass below, above the vaulted sky.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So you guys encountered what's probably the most shocking thing in this poem is that there's a line that is enjambed. Do you remember that word? That means it runs between two lines. This one runs not only between 2 lines, but 2 stanzas. So, right? So if you look at line 6, and yet I am and live like vapors tossed into the nothingness of scorn and noise. It's really, really an extreme enjambment because it crosses across two stanzas that he even has numerically separated. So if you want to enact how far he feels he's been tossed, that's how far. I mean, it's really, really a violent kind of poetic maneuver at the same time as it's describing something very violent, which is the feeling of being completely alienated, completely turned away from, completely alone. So I invite you to, if you're still searching for a poem to do a close reading of this, I think this is a great one. I think it's a really, really powerful poem and very, very sophisticated in terms of its poetic form and the kinds of things that it does. But you see again in that final section, I long for scenes where man hath never trod, a place where woman never smiled or wept, there to abide with my Creator God and sleep as I in childhood sweetly slept, untroubling and untroubled where I lie, the grass below, above the vaulted sky. So it's not quite a death wish, but it's certainly a wish to be either completely sort of safe and enmeshed or completely left alone to die or something. I'm not sure, but you see how it sort of plays itself out. And I think it doesn't make any sense to fetishize John Clare and say, oh my goodness, the great, because that's just the same problem. It's sort of the same problem of kind of paternally looking down on this lower class poet. But I think he's a really, really interesting poet for the reasons that the same idea that Keats had about having no identity, when it's carried to this kind of extreme, it becomes a different sort of story. Any questions about anything I've said so far about John Clare? So again, was not read much in the 19th century at all after that early little flush of success in the 1810s. Not really read much at all. Kind of recovered again in the 20th century, and then really, these days, my friends are writing about John Clare like crazy, largely about his journals and his writing in his journals, and they're doing really fine work on his writing. Also about walking in John Clare. So a lot of these poets are big walkers, like they would walk hundreds and hundreds of miles and write about it, and it becomes a kind of thing to write about if you're interested in this sort of thing. Okay? All right. So let's make the turn. Let's make the turn to Victorian poetry then. And as we make this turn to Victorian poetry, I want to return again to the idea, two kind of related ideas. One is negative capability. So that's one idea, and the other idea that's related to negative capability is beauty equals truth, which he says, if you remember, is at the end of Ode on a Grecian Urn. Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Right? That's the final lines of Ode on a Grecian Urn, which we looked at last Wednesday. And what I want to sort of suggest is that this legacy is one legacy that gets left to Victorians. And so let me show you a little PowerPoint that I kind of, it's not PowerPoint, but it's something, and I'm not sure quite what to call it. Stop it. I don't want to rename it, I just want to open it. Stop. Okay, I just want to open it. All right, maybe I'll have to do this differently. It's very annoying. Shoot. Let's see what happens if I do this. There we go. All right. So this is just one narrative. I don't. This is just something I did for a class once. So just to give you this, and this is up on Carmen, so you can sort of follow it. So Keats dies in 1821. Shelley dies in 1822. Byron dies in 1824. Then there's this long period where it's sort of there's not really one poet. I would say Hemans is probably the most popular poet, and then Tennyson's first book of poems comes out in 1830. I think he was only 20 or 21. He had published a book of poems with his brother when they were in their teens, but this is the first fully fledged book of poems he wrote. And then the Great Reform Bill, and at that point, Victoria is also, she ascends to the crown, but she's not actually crowned queen until 1838 when she's old enough. So this is the sort of trajectory. So Tennyson, and this is an old picture of Tennyson. If you want to see a young picture of Tennyson, I have a big one on my wall of my office, so you can come and see a young picture of Tennyson. A very serious figure here. Would fit right in some kind of hipster bars probably right now. But at the time, he had a very difficult kind of upbringing, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. But instead, what I'll say is like, well, let's go ahead and yes. Okay. Tennyson had an alcoholic father. Of the 4 boys or 5 boys, I can't remember, that were his sons, 2 of them committed suicide and 1 ended up in an institution for the rest of his life. They were severely traumatized by their father, who was a minister, but an alcoholic and extremely abusive. Why does this figure in Tennyson's poetry? There is a kind of sadness in his poetry that I attribute largely to this kind of like upbringing. I don't know whether or not that matters much, but there's this real sadness in his poetry. This is complicated by the fact that when he finally gets to Cambridge, he meets this guy Arthur Hallam, and he meets a number of other guys. They form this group called the Apostles, the Cambridge Apostles, and they read philosophy together. They're really excited. They're all really bright. They come from all different walks of life. Hallam was rather upper class, and Tennyson was rather lower class, but it didn't matter. They were both smart, and they loved each other, and they were great friends. And then Tennyson discovers that Hallam had died while he was on a trip of a brain aneurysm. So he just dies, boom, like this. Hallam had reviewed Tennyson's first book of poems. He had said that there were 2 kinds of poets. One is the poet of sensation, and the other is the poet of reflection. The poet of sensation, he says, is Tennyson, and also Keats, by the way. So I think Keats is really important to Tennyson. And Wordsworth is the poet of reflection. Okay? So this is kind of the way that things end up going. Okay. I'm not going to talk about Mill. So that's as much as we need to say about Tennyson. Since it's not a class on poetry, I'm not going to say much more than that. Okay. All right. So again, I've already said some of this, but I'm going to kind of redouble, and it'll be up on Carmen. Out of Romantic poetry, basically poets have 2 directions they can go into, right? You can either follow this poetry of reflection, which I call duty in Wordsworth. By that I mean you can either kind of become a poet who is in relation to an other, who is probably a more authorial or authoritative, like big other, like the state or God or nature or whatever, nature with a capital N, and or you can be this poet of sensation like Keats. Now, in the end, by the time Tennyson is a mature poet, like you saw with the beard and everything, he had become both. He'd become a conservative who more or less reflected the poet of reflection, but he was a poet of sensation when it came to the kind of verse that he wrote. Right? So Tennyson was criticized as being too flowery and effeminate in his poetry. Keats was criticized for being too flowery and effeminate in their poetry. Do you see what I mean? They were going against this kind of rough-hewn natural poetry, and they were writing things that were different. And here, the other things I've written here are just other things I said already, so I'm going to skip over them. So if you see, I'm kind of making an argument that, like, on the side of Wordsworth, you have intellectual pleasure, ethical commitment to the experience of the everyday, and this leads to humanism and liberalism. And on sensation, with Keats, you have bodily pleasure and an ethical commitment to beauty as its own end. And that leads to what's called later in the 19th century aestheticism. Now, aestheticism, if you want a simple definition, the easiest one and the one we use in this class is art for art's sake. So art doesn't have to represent some good. It can just be beautiful. It can just be exciting. That's what the aestheticists believe, and when we come to them in Oscar Wilde, in John Ruskin, in William Pater, you'll see that that's what they believed. They believed in a kind of just a beautiful poetry. Now, we already did Ode to Anna Grecian Urn, so I'd like to turn then to Tennyson. And the first, I'm going to try to do two things with Tennyson, two of his poems, and if we're lucky, we'll get to a few poems by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I've already said all this stuff, so I'm going to just kind of skip over it. But it will be on Carmen. So let's look at your packet. I want to look at a poem called Mariana, which is from that first collection. So the one that we're looking at is the, where do I have a copy for myself? Hold on. Yes, I do. Everybody have one of these? Okay, good. All right, so there's a long intro which I gave you, but I want to start with the poem Mariana, which is on the third page. So again, this comes out in 1830, so he was super young when he writes this, 1809, so he's 21. Yes. All right, so he basically he gets the title and the scene from a really quick line in a Shakespeare play. So it's not very much, but he just sort of moves on from here, okay? So here we go. I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about how I think it plays into this question of the poet having an identity or no identity, okay? It's a hard poem to read, so I'll do my best. So the epigraph is Mariana in the moated grange, which is from Measure for Measure. With blackest moss, the flower pots were thickly crusted, one and all. The rusty nails fell from the knots that held the pair to the gable wall. The broken sheds looked sad and strange. Uplifted was the clinking latch. Weeded and worn the ancient thatch upon the lonely moated grange. She only said, my life is dreary. He cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, weary. I would that I were dead. Her tears fell with the dews at even. Her tears fell ere the dews were dried. She could not look on the sweet heaven, either at morn or eventide, after the flitting of the bats, when the thickest dark did trance the sky. She drew the casement curtain by, and glanced athwart the glooming flats. She only said, the night is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, weary, I would that I were dead. Upon the middle of the night, waking, she heard the night fowl crow. The cock sung an hour ere light. From the dark fen, the oxen's low came to her with the hope of change. In sleep she seemed to walk forlorn, till cold winds woke the gray-eyed morn. About the lonely moated grange, she only said, the day is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. About a stone's cast from the wall, a sluice with blackened waters slept, and o'er it many round and small the clustered marish mosses crept. Hard by, a poplar shook all way, all silver green with gnarled bark. For leagues no other tree did mark the level waste. the rounding gray. She only said, my life is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, and I would that I were dead. And ever when the moon was low, and the shrill winds were up and away, in the white curtains to and fro, she saw the gusty shadows sway. And when the moon was very low, and the wild winds bound within their cell, the shadow of the poplar fell upon her bed, across her brow. She only said, the night is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I wish that I were dead. All day within the dreamy house, the doors upon their hinges creaked, the blue fly sung in the pane, the mouse behind the mouldering wainscot shrieked. Or from the crevice peered about, old faces glimmered through the doors, old footsteps trod the upper floors, old voices called her from without. She only said, my life is dreary, he cometh not, she said. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. The sparrows chirrup on the roof, the slow clocks ticking, and the sound which to the wooing wind aloof the poplar made, did all confound her sense. But she most loathed the hour when the thick-moted sunbeam lay athwart the chambers, and the day was sloping toward his western bower. Then, she said, I am very dreary. He will not come, she said. She wept, I am a weary, O God, that I were dead. Okay, I am slightly traumatized by this poem because when I was in graduate school and had to do my orals, one of my committee members had heard me do, I guess she thought, a very good reading of this poem in her class. Not reading out loud, but like a good interpretation of this poem. And she asked me to do it, and I got it confused with another Tennyson poem. Started talking about another one, and she was like, no, I meant, and I was like, oh. Anyway, so I'm a little traumatized by it. It was marked one of my many failures in life. But I love this poem, and I sort of want to make a case for why this poem fits a kind of Keatsian frame better than it fits a Wordsworthian one. So I'm just going to give you the last few stanzas here and talk about them. So the first thing, so you notice the chorus, right? The refrain or chorus that happens each time, right? So that is here, and it repeats each time. And if you were doing a close reading of this, you'd probably want to mention that the rhythm changes when he goes to that, right? The rhythm suddenly changes, and it becomes so. I won't go into it very much, but the whole poem is tetrameter until it gets to that final, those final choruses, and then it turns into like a little ballad measure stuck right in there. So it goes 4/3, 4/3 in terms of the rhythms. But what I want to sort of suggest to you is that, well, let me put it this way to you. Where is the I in this poem?
Referring to the being weary.
The being weary, yeah, but that's a quotation. So that's not the speaker, right? The speaker doesn't say that. He's quoting her. He's quoting Mariana. But you're right that is an I. So Mariana appears in the poem, but it's only reported, so it's secondhand. Is there a sort of speaker I in the poem? What do you think? I don't think so. I think it's like, at least to me, it feels like instead of an I like this, you get an I like this. You get an I that sort of moves through the poem, right? You get a kind of like cinematic vision of what things are like. And it kind of traces her experience from morning to night, and you get this kind of this sort of change. And what I want to sort of suggest is that here he is a poet that has no identity, right? And he's on the side of negative capability, beauty equals truth, right? You don't need any deeper meaning. Now there are places here where it slips from me. Like I remembered just now reading it what I had said in Yogi Prince's Victorian poetry class when I was in graduate school. I had said that penultimate stanza, the second to last stanza, is filled with other presences that seem to me like haunted parts of a subjectivity, right? Old faces glimmered through the doors, old footsteps trod the upper floors, old voices called her from without. That part of the poem, to me, is like memory something, right? It feels like memory and something like a subjectivity. Otherwise, we only know that she's alone and waiting for a guy, and he's probably not coming. That's all we really know. But that part to me seems, and otherwise, it's only, rusty hinges, gnarly tree, only one tree that throws light, and then like a fetid water in a trough. You don't get any real beauty. Or if it's beautiful, it's this kind of dark beauty. It's a kind of gothic beauty, right? Okay. So I want to now look at the poems from a book of poems called In Memoriam. And I sort of saw some of you, you saw that I wrote about this. I have this here. So Hallam dies in 1832, 2 years after the poems. And then Tennyson begins writing these elegies right after his friend dies. And he doesn't, not only does he not date, not only does he not get married, he doesn't even date. He basically stays single for a long time. And yes?
Were they lovers?
No, not so far as we know. But I think they loved each other very much, and especially for Tennyson, given the way he had adopted Hallam's family after coming from such a messed up family, it was like too great of a loss. Tennyson's sister was supposed to marry Hallam. It was like that. Now, people have written about this and they go, you remember the letters? Maybe they don't, so I don't know. But there's no evidence of that in any of the letters back and forth, right? And it's also, I don't know if there's more fluidity in that kind of thing, at Cambridge. Who knows? I don't know. But we don't know. I don't know. But definitely, it was a deep loss for him. And the way he works through this loss, and the way I understand it, is the way he works through this loss is he begins to write these poems. And he called them the elegies. And he kept them in a book like this. And he carried the book around with him, and he'd walk around London, and he'd go to stay with friends. And he was really like this. Like they would say, Tennyson came to say, oh, good, so how long has he been there? 2 weeks, And you just come, and you just like hang out and drink coffee and constantly smoke his pipe and write poems, right? And then he'd go on to the next person's house and occasionally publish, and he was really well renowned, in fact, when Wordsworth is made the poet laureate, after Thelwall died, I think it's in the 1830, maybe, around that. Wordsworth is made poet laureate of England. The next poet laureate in 1850 is Tennyson. He takes over that role of being the nation's poet. And so, but what happens in between 1832 and 1850 when he publishes In Memoriam is he writes hundreds of these little poems. And each one is like a little working through of grief. It's the slowest working through of grief you've ever seen in your life. It's quite beautiful in a way, because they all have the same form, this A-B-B-A stanza, which is now called the In Memoriam stanza, right? So let's go ahead and look at it. I've given you just some parts from this long poem called In Memoriam. It's like a very long poem. Quite beautiful. All right, so I skipped over the preface, which is also written in exactly the same kind of meter. So it's on this page here that has the first part that says in memoriam and then has 1, 2, and 3 on it. Now, even though the stanza is exactly the same in all the poems, there aren't the same number of stanzas in each section or canto. Does that make sense? No, honestly, does it make sense what I just said? Turn the page to the next page, it'll make more sense. If you turn the page to the next one, you'll see that there are a number 6 that I crossed out because I didn't want you to read, because it just seemed like, look how many stanzas there are there. You see what I mean? It's not just 4, 4, 4 in each one. It's like whatever he's feeling like at the time. In fact, when he had all these elegies together, he had to try to make a story out of it, a journey of losing Hallam, and then Christmases matter. Strange. It's a very kind of almost Christian poem. Christmases matter. There were these different Christmases, and then he just sort of follows the years along, and then he finally is ready to let go of the loss. All right, so let's look at number 1. Sorry, I'm just going to copy it over so I've got it here. These are some of my favorite verses in all of literature, but they're very, very simple. They're very the opposite of the kind of complex language he's capable of. They're very, very simple and not very, very showy, right? All right, so 1. I held a truth with him who sings to one clear harp in diverse tones, that men may rise on stepping stones of their dead selves to higher things. But who shall so forecast the years and find in loss again to match, or reach a hand through time to catch the far-off interest of tears? Let love clasp grief, lest both be drowned. Let darkness keep her raven gloss. Ah, sweeter to be drunk with loss, to dance with death, to beat the ground, than that the victor hours should scorn the long result of love and boast, behold the man that loved and lost, but all he was is overworn. So I mean, there's the only thing that's maybe a little complicated here is that he uses poetic inversions sometimes. So he inverts the syntax. So you're like, wait, what's he saying? But it's just because he inverted the syntax, right? The figures here that recur throughout are hands. Hands and trying to clasp hands and being unable to touch them, again, become the kind of main figure in a lot of the poems. So he says, to reach a hand through time to catch the far-off interest of tears. And then he says, let love clasp grief, lest both be drowned. So I guess the image here is love as a kind of saving grace that sort of saves grief. But do you see that he's sort of suggesting that we stay in grief? He's not saying that you should let go of your grief. He's sort of saying, yeah, stay with it. Right? You know how people tell you, oh, cheer up, get over it, like whatever? This is not that poem. This is not the poem. The poem that he wants to write here is a poem that says, I'm not ready to move on yet. I'm just not ready. And I think that's kind of beautiful, right? When I'm not ready, when I'm ready, I'll let you know. And in fact, this is amazing, right? He publishes in 1850, he publishes the poems, he gets married, he becomes poet laureate, right? All in a 2-year span. He has his first child. Guess what? The child's name was Helen. Guess what? The child was stillborn. Right? Stillborn on Easter Sunday. And he's like, but she got pregnant again. She had a baby. Guess what his name was? Hallam. Guess what? He lived. Guess what? He was a wonderful man. He loved his dad, and they grew up, and he became the actual editor of his father's poetry and executor of his estate when his dad died. But you see what I mean? It took a long, long time for him to grieve that loss. And so it's like you have in Tennyson, in one person, you have both of these things. You have Wordsworth here and Keats here, and you have sort of like Tennyson here producing the kind of poetry that would become the poetry of modernism. Like they both sort of enter in as two different strands, right? The strand of reflection, which I can't imagine any poem that's more full of reflection than In Memoriam. And the poem of sensation, which, I mean, many of his poems, including this poem, are filled with sensation. But then you have sort of both of them coming together in Tennyson. And, I don't know, just like sitting there and kind of cooking for a while and finally producing these poems. I want to look at one other... yes, let's look at number 5, I think. So I sometimes hold it half a sin to put in words the grief I feel, for words, like nature, half reveal and half conceal the soul within. But for the unquiet heart and brain, a use in measured language lies, the sad mechanic exercise like dull narcotics numbing pain. In words, like weeds, I'll wrap me o'er, like coarsest clothes against the cold. But that large grief which these enfold is given outline and no more. So, I love this idea that just like, you see what I mean? Like he can't write. It's almost like these elegies have to be in this simple meter. In order to hold, the grief. It's like a counting exercise. Right? When you're stressed, what do you do? When you're stressed out, what do you do? What? What is that? Sleep. Some people sleep. What else? Some people run. Runners like to run. You know people that are like that. It's like, oh, wow, run 6 miles. Right? He writes poems. He writes these poems. That's how he handles his grief, right? It's this kind of movement. But he understands that they can't really get at it. They can just be a sort of placeholder for now. Okay. Right. Let's look at these sonnets by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So next time we are going to read the poems of Robert Browning. This will be on your recording, right? Because I won't be here on Wednesday. So when you listen to the poems of Robert Browning, you're going to hear one of the great Victorian poets. By the way, I would look back and make sure you look over Tennyson's poem Ulysses, which is included in your packet. The reason being that it is a dramatic monologue, and next time I'm going to talk a lot about dramatic monologue, which is another way outside of this problem of identity and the egotistical sublime is to use a dramatic monologue, which is what he does. But anyway, I want to move towards Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So what we have is Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a well-known poet in her own right. She had published poems. Her father was an intellectual, and she basically lived at home as a kind of an invalid in her early life. She begins a correspondence Robert Browning, who at the time was probably, after Tennyson, the most popular poet in England. So, how to talk about this? If Tennyson is sort of like really like mainstream popular, Browning is sort of like for the alternative intellectual set, right? He's much more popular with that set. And she loved his poems, and they began corresponding and writing letters back and forth. And he said, well, let me come and visit. And so he comes and visits, and they have coffee, whatever, and get to know each other, go on walks. And before too long, they fall in love and get married, right? When they are on their honeymoon, she says, oh, by the way, I have these sonnets I wrote to you while we were corresponding back and forth. So maybe it's just a gift. And he's like, I want to publish them. She's like, no, you can't publish them. Just my gift to you. And he goes, they're too good. You have to let them out, and whatever. And they kind of go back and forth, and she says, okay. So he edits them and publishes them, and they're some of the most famous poems in English. The one that's most famous is probably one of my least favorites. It's that one, how do I love you? Let me count the ways. That one. Yeah, that's an Elizabeth Barrett Browning sonnet. Don't judge the whole works by that, okay? What you have here is her manuscript versions. So you're welcome, because you can't find them elsewhere, okay? If you look online, you'll get the versions that were printed from when he retyped them, or he typed them in. These are her manuscript versions, and why are they so cool? Look at all the kinds of ways she marks the poems up. With equal signs, with weird dashes, those are all gone. The ellipses, the dot, 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 all that is gone, right? So that's all from Barrett Browning, from her manuscript, okay? I'm going to look for my favorite. Oh, look, I cut it out. I'm such a dummy. Cut out one of my favorites. Let's do this. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give you the poem straight from Poetry Foundation or something. Oops. Sonnet 22, I think. If I'm wrong, we'll go back to one of these, but I think this is it. It's just so good, people. Yes. I'm not wrong. Okay. I'll put it on Carmen so you have it, okay? Uh-oh. What happened? Stop it. Stop it, stop it, stop it. There we go. All right. So you don't have the cool markings, so I don't have that for you. I'll find it and I'll send it to you. I've got it somewhere on my computer. When our two souls stand up erect and strong, face to face, silent, drawing nigh and nigher, until the lengthening wings break into fire at either curved point, what bitter wrong can the earth do to us, that we should not long be here contented? Think. In mounting higher, the angels would press on us and aspire to drop some golden orb of perfect song into our deep, dear silence. Let us stay rather on earth, beloved, where the unfit, contrarious moods of men recoil away and isolate pure spirits, and permit a place to stand and love in for a day with darkness and the death hour rounding it. I think I need to read that one more time. When our two souls stand up erect and strong, face to face, silent, drawing nigh and nigher until the lengthening wings break into fire at either curved point, what bitter wrong can the earth do to us, that we should not long be here contented? Think. In burning higher, the angels would press on us and aspire to drop some golden orb of perfect song into our deep, dear silence. Let us stay rather on earth, beloved, where the unfit, contrarious moods of men recoil away and isolate pure spirits, and permit a place to stand and love in for a day, with darkness and the death hour rounding it. So what I love about this poem, there's so many things. First of all, if for thinking about your close reading papers, I would say in this poem to think about the way you almost don't hear any rhymes because she enjams so severely, right? You read right through the end rhymes, you don't hear the rhymes. They almost disappear, which is a beautiful, beautiful effect. So you don't get that rhyming, chimey sound, but you still keep the form. The other thing I would say is this is monumental, right? In the middle of the poem, right? Think. You say, okay, think. Right? And basically, the message to me is so beautiful. Let's just stay here. Let's don't be there. Let's stay here. Because here, where there's mortality, wherever that's the pure form of our love. This other kind of whatever, I think that it's up to that. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a wonderful poet. She wrote a long poem called Aurora Leigh, based on Wordsworth's Prelude, which is also itself a long poem. It's, depending on which version you get, it can be 14 books or it can be a 2-book prelude. It grows over the years. He never publishes it while he's alive. But she publishes Aurora Leigh, which is a woman's version of becoming a poet, not a man's version. It's like the only thing like this that you have. And in the poem, men are telling her all the time, women can't write, women can't write, women can't write. They're saying this to Aurora Leigh over and over again. And she doesn't believe them. And it's a really wonderful poem. It's amazing. But, so this is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She's super, super smart. And you read these poems and you're like, I want to be in a love affair like that. I want to like have that kind of, that kind of intellectual, stimulation back and forth. Right? Okay. Questions about any of this stuff? So the sonnet sequence becomes a really, really important vehicle in the Victorian period. The two great sonnet sequences are one from Christina Rossetti and the other from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, both part of the Victorian women's poet movement, and there were a lot of really great Victorian women poets. It's strange they were called poetesses, Yeah, I know about that, but, they were puppets, okay, so. Okay, I don't have anything more to say, so please enjoy yourselves and, enjoy the day where you don't have to come to class. I will send out reminders so no one shows up. We will have the first class. Sorry. We will have the first class, just not the second class. I saw that one coming.
Yes, that is the plan. Of course, if you don't get a job or you don't do a good enough job, then the entire idea behind this just falls apart.
All right, let's see if we can Yeah, I'll put that up. I'll give you Thank you for asking. Yeah. What's that? I gave you somebody else's test. I'm sorry about that. Did I not give you yours? There you are. I'm so sorry.